You hear about World War I and think trenches, gas, Verdun. Almost nobody talks about what happened in 1917 when the largest army on Earth just stopped being an army. 7 million men, orders ignored, officers beaten, regiments walking away mid-battle. By October 29th, 1917, the Russian Minister of Food Procurement stands in front of his government and admits there is no grain left to feed soldiers or the capital, no bread, no army. The Eastern Front is collapsing, not from enemy fire, but from the inside. And what happens to those millions of men is uglier than any German offensive. Who were they? Where did they go? What killed them when the state itself just gave up? The Russian Empire mobilized 12 million men between 1914 and 1917. 12 million. More bodies than any belligerent had ever thrown into war. But by February 1917, when the Tsar abdicates, somewhere between 1.7 and 2 million are already dead. Another 4.9 million are wounded. 2.5 million sit in prisoner camps or are listed missing. The United States War Department tallies it cold. 9.15 million total casualties before the army even breaks. The infantry, where 80% of soldiers were peasants, took almost all of it. Professional officers, the aristocrats, died in the first campaigns. By 1916, the ranks were filled with clerks and educated peasants promoted from below. The command structure is fraying before anyone mutinies. March 1st, 1917. The Petrograd Soviet issues Order Number 1. Soldiers and sailors now obey officers only if orders do not contradict Soviet decrees. Soldiers, committees form in every unit. The order never explicitly says, elect your officers, but soldiers hear it that way. Within weeks, committees are countermanding orders, dismissing commanders, voting on whether to attack. Discipline, the thing that keeps any army alive under fire, starts dying, not overnight. The spring of 1917 still has structure. The Stavka counts 7,6,700 soldiers in April, the largest Russian force ever fielded, replacements trained, supply shortages from 1914 and 15 mostly solved, Allied aid flowing into Arkhangelsk. On paper, this army should hold. On paper, Alexander Kerensky becomes Minister of War in May. He needs a victory to unite the country, restore morale, prove the revolution works. He names Alexei Brusilov commander-in-chief. Brusilov, who smashed Austria-Hungary in summer 1916, inflicting over 1 million casualties. That offensive cost Russia dearly. Historians argue it bled the army so badly that 1917's collapse was inevitable. But Kerensky wants that energy again. He tours trenches in June, calls the Russian army the freest military force in the world. Volunteer shock battalions form. Women's battalions of death. Middle-class patriots head to the front. The offensive is set for July 1st by the Gregorian calendar, June 18th old style. Kerensky believes a win will rally everyone behind the provisional government. Field commanders know better. General Mikhail Alexeyev, chief of staff from March to June, requests reports from the front. Most officers say the same thing. Discipline gone, fighting ability collapsed. Troops might hold defensively. Offensive operations should wait. Soldiers, committees, debate every order. The death penalty, abolished after the February Revolution, is not there to enforce obedience. Bolshevik agitators are everywhere, preaching anti-war messages. Between March 24th and May 1st, 7,000 copies of Pravda, 2,000 of Soldatskaya Pravda. Over 30,000 of the Social Democrat flood the front. Between May 1st and June 11th, another 7,000 Pravda, 32,000 Social Democrat, 61,000 Soldatskaya Pravda. Paragraph 6 of the Declaration of Soldiers. Rights says all printed matter must reach the addressee. No censorship. Revolutionary literature pours in. Anton Denikin, Brusilov's chief of staff, notes that about 60 officers commanding Army Corps or regiments are dismissed at the start of operations, deposed by committees or lack of confidence votes. The Minsk Soviet of Workmen's and Soldiers. Delegates votes 123 to 79 against authorizing the attack. The 169th Infantry Division's committees declare attacking the enemy is treason to the revolution. July 1st. The Russian 7th, 8th and 11th armies hit Austro-German lines in Galicia, pushing toward Lviv. 2 days of artillery fire precede the assault. It does little. Deserters and Petrograd newspapers already told the enemy when and where. Central powers evacuate trenches, wait it out. The initial push works anyway. Shock battalions, the volunteers, drive forward with real energy. The 11th Army's Czechoslovak Brigade takes Zborov. Kornilov's 8th Army captures Stanislaw, advances on Kalush, grabs thousands of prisoners. For a week it looks like Kerensky might be right. Then the reserves refuse to move. Frontline troops call for relief. Reserves stay in their positions. Committees vote no. On July 6th, General Laver Kornilov's success earns him promotion to commander of the Southwestern Front. It does not matter. July 19th, the Germans counterattack the 11th Army. Russian numerical superiority means nothing. The reliable units, the shock battalions, have taken most of the casualties. What is left will not fight. By July 21st, the 11th Army abandons positions. July 22nd, the German blow hits the 7th Army. Both armies retreat. It turns into a rout. Officers and NCOs are the only ones offering resistance. By July 23rd, the 8th Army withdraws too. In less than a week, the Russians give up 120 kilometers of ground. The Central Powers retake nearly all of eastern Galicia. The operation collapses. The cost is counted in broken units. How many died in the Kerensky Offensive is debated. Figures are incomplete, but the moral cost is absolute. Russian soldiers realize their commanders cannot make them fight. Kerensky, now Prime Minister, replaces Brusilov with Kornilov. The Army Command tells Kerensky on July 29th that every policy the provisional government implemented since February has destroyed the army. Kerensky agrees they must restore order. Too late. Kornilov tries a coup in August. It fails. Soldiers distrust Kerensky for his lenient treatment of the conspirators. Troops refuse orders from the high command. The Bolsheviks spread into units across the front. Before, Bolshevik influence was mostly the northern front near Petrograd. Now it is everywhere. If you value documented Eastern Front history like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the 1914 to 1918 online encyclopedia, which compiled primary documents including military censorship reports, commissar correspondence, and frontline dispatches published in July 2024, and the detailed casualty studies published by the Institute for the Study of War at Sciences, Poe Mass Violence and Resistance Research Network. Now back to the information. Desertion becomes epidemic. March 1st, 1917. Authorities detain 195,130 soldiers trying to leave the front for the Russian interior. August 1st, 1917. That number is 365,137. An increase of 170,000 in 5 months. These are only the ones caught. Conservative estimates suggest half of deserters evade capture, meaning Russia's 7 million strong army shed roughly 340,000 men in 5 months, nearly 5% gone. By year's end, over 14%. If you take Vladimir Putin's own modern figure of 700,000 Russian troops deployed in Ukraine and apply 1917's desertion rate, the scale becomes clear. By October, 1 million or more have walked away. Fraternization explodes at Easter 1916. Dozens of soldiers cross to enemy lines. Easter 1917, hundreds of regiments do it. Unlike the Western Front, where fraternization stays ritualized and brief, on the Eastern Front it grows into anti-war action. Soldiers trade with Germans and Austrians, share food, drink together, refuse to go back to fighting. Military offenses, drunkenness, theft of military property, all surge. Soldiers embezzle supplies, trade them on black markets for food and consumer goods. The cost of living is rising in Russia. Profiteering is rampant. The army is rotting from the inside while still technically in the field. September 3rd, 1917. The Germans take Riga, 60,000 Russian casualties. Soldiers defending the city refuse to fight. Flee from advancing troops. Kornilov stabilizes the front by mid-August after the July disaster, but the offensive potential is gone. The Russian army can no longer attack. By November, after the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks take control. They abolish the officer corps in December. The formal disintegration begins, but most units are already hollow. Troops are not leaving because the Bolsheviks tell them to. They are leaving because there is no food, no reason, and no punishment that works anymore. October 27th, 1917. Petrograd has 152 carloads of bread. Daily consumption, 40 cars. Daily arrival, 20 to 22 cars. The city has 7 or 8 days of food. The Northern Front sends a telegram. Hunger is menacing the army. Bakeries stop working. No flour. The last hardtack reserves are being consumed. When they finish, starvation breaks out. General Chermisov confirms it. Food situation catastrophic. Horses dying for lack of forage. Every hour of delay threatens to ruin the army. 400,000 poods of bread shipped via the Mariinsky Canal. 200,000 stolen or detained en route. Peasants from Novgorod and Olenetsk plunder barges. Soldiers escorting transports cannot or will not stop them. A telegram from Rybinsk. Armed peasants steal 120,000 poods of flour from a barge. Soldiers sent to retrieve it refuse. Petrograd's food procurement minister, Sergei Prokopovich, admits publicly on October 29th that little or no grain remains in government storage to feed the army and residents of the capital. This is not a supply problem. This is state collapse. Why? The economics are brutal. Russia mobilized 15 million males into the army over 3 years. 15 million. Those men had to be fed as soldiers, not farmers. Traditional peasant farms, which made up 80% of Russian agriculture, operated under communal land tenure. They were not designed for market sales. They grew food for the commune. The war pulled labor off those farms, men and horses both. Output of cereals dropped by 1/5. But more damaging, peasants who used to sell grain to cities stopped. No economic incentive. Inflation made rubles worthless. Consumer goods disappeared from stores. Why trade grain for paper? Peasant households went autarkic, kept everything for themselves. The Tsarist government believed enough grain existed in the empire. They were right. The mistake was thinking they could distribute it. Local procurement committees, state controls, expanding regulations, none of it worked. Peasants simply refused to sell. The countryside held grain while cities and armies starved. By late summer 1917, Petrograd has 2 days of bread reserves. Roads, river ports, and railroads jam with bagmen. Individuals traveling to surplus areas, buying grain, carrying it back to towns in grain-poor northern provinces. They skirt restrictions on private sales. They have to. Official supply channels are dead. October brings abundant season. Instead, supplies dwindle. Prices soar. Food lines are everywhere. Petrograd, far from grain-producing areas, suffers worst. Only 1/10 of pre-war milk supply reaches the city. The population has swollen from refugees, war workers, displaced persons. Starvation becomes real in 1917. People migrate from consuming areas to producing areas, cities to countryside. This wave mixes with refugees fleeing frontline zones. People escaping revolutionary unrest in Petrograd and Moscow. Grain reserves in the countryside are not eaten. They are converted to moonshine. Samagon becomes the stable currency of revolutionary times. The soldiers at the front face the same equation. Official rations do not arrive. When they do, they are insufficient. In 1914, the army supply grew constantly and maintained high rations. Table 1 in the Food and Nutrition Study from the 1914 to 1918 online encyclopedia, published July 9th, 2024, are stars, shows millions of kilograms delivered monthly. By 1917, that system breaks. General Cheremissov is not exaggerating when he says horses are starving and bakeries have no flour. Frontline units go days without bread. Hardtack, the dry biscuit that can keep for months, is gone. No reserves. Soldiers know what happens next. You do not need Bolshevik agitation when you are 3 days from starvation. Vladimir Lenin later says Russian soldiers voted for peace with their legs. Accurate. Walk away or die of hunger in a trench for a government that cannot feed you. Not a hard choice, but walking away is not safety. Deserters face the gauntlet. In the chaos of 1917, some slip through. Others are caught and sent back to their units, often to assault units. Where survival odds are lowest, military courts proliferate, but enforcement is uneven. Local authorities sometimes execute deserters on the spot, sometimes not. The infrastructure to track and punish millions of men does not exist. By autumn 1917, with the provisional government barely functioning and the Bolsheviks preparing to seize power, desertion is functionally unpunishable. The Red Army, when it forms in January 1918, will face the same problem. Leon Trotsky, Commissar of War, will later institute blocking units, special squads placed behind front lines tasked with shooting deserters and soldiers retreating without authorization. In 1918 and 1919, the Czech Special Investigations Forces follow the Red Army, conducting field tribunals and summary executions of soldiers who desert, retreat, or fail to show offensive zeal. The Bolsheviks theorize this violence as mass terror, but that is next year. In 1917, deserters just vanish into the countryside. For officers, 1917 is deadly in a different way. Order number 1 strips their authority. Soldiers, committees, countermand decisions. The abolition of corporal punishment removes the last enforcement tool. Then the violence starts. Not everywhere. Not immediately. But in enough places that officers begin to fear their own men. The February Revolution sees some lynchings, not widespread, but visible. Soldiers who spent years under brutal discipline find the tables turned. Some officers are beaten. Some are stripped of rank, humiliated, driven from units. In Petrograd, during the initial revolutionary days in late February, around 100 people are killed or wounded when troops fire into crowds. Then the Volinsky Regiment mutinies on February 27th. They kill their commanding officer. Make common cause with demonstrators. Other regiments follow. The president of the Duma, Michael Rodzianko, sends a telegram to the Tsar. The situation is serious. There is anarchy in the capital. By summer 1917, as the Kerensky Offensive fails and units disintegrate, officers face mobs. Soldiers who will not fight the Germans are willing to turn on commanders they blame for their misery. Denikin reports in his July 28th testimony that officers are being dismissed, arrested, sometimes worse. Exact numbers are impossible. Censorship materials, commissar reports, and correspondence between army staffs document the collapse but do not count every beaten or killed officer. What we know, dozens of senior commanders, corps and regiment level, are forced out during the June-July operations. Lower-level officers face soldiers' wrath in individual incidents that go unrecorded except in scattered memoirs and local reports. The systematic extermination comes later. In November 1917, after the Bolshevik takeover, the killing intensifies. General Nikolai Dukhonin surrenders to the Bolshevik Krylenko in Mogilev on November 20th, December 3rd, new style. Krylenko tries to protect him. Dukhonin is lynched by a mob of Bolshevik sailors from the Baltic Fleet. In mid-January 1918, sailors in Odessa kill officers and junkers by throwing them from the cruiser Almaz. According to one account, a colonel is roasted alive in a locomotive engine. In Rostov, shortly after the Bolshevik takeover in November 1917, workers surround 50 officer cadets. The cadets surrender, believing their lives will be spared. They are taken to a metal factory and thrown one at a time into the blast furnace. In Taganrog, 50 cadets, one at a time, metal factory, blast furnace. The Junker Mutiny in Petrograd, October 29th, 1917, sees military school cadets rise against the Bolsheviks. It fails. The cadets from Vladimirskoye Military School are subjected to severe artillery shelling, hundreds killed or injured. After surrender, dozens are shot at the walls of the Peter and Paul Fortress. The cadets from Nikolaevskoye School of Engineers fight briefly, then flee or are disarmed. Those who remain are sent to the Peter and Paul Fortress. Some are executed. The Red Guard and revolutionary soldiers at that point do not hesitate. By December 1917, the Soviet government formally dissolves the officer corps. 250,000 officers released, most loyal to the Romanov monarchy, no allegiance to Bolsheviks. The new regime has no intention of maintaining the old army. Risk of counter-revolution too high. In January 1918, the Sovnarkom decrees formation of the Worker-Peasant Red Army. The Red Guards, armed factory workers and disgruntled ex-soldiers, numbering about 200,000, one-sixth of that in Petrograd, are loyal but untrained. The threat of continued war with Germany and rising internal opposition necessitate a larger professional force. By 1920, more than 250,000 Imperial Army veterans are drafted into the Red Army. To ensure obedience, Trotsky attaches commissars to every unit, Bolshevik watchdogs who shadow officers, report on loyalty, efficiency, enthusiasm. The Cheka guarantees compliance. In some cases, families of officers are threatened if disloyalty appears. Trotsky is brutal. After defeats in mid-1918, reports of desertion and retreat prompt formation of blocking units. Shoot deserters, shoot unauthorized retreaters. Stalin will use the same tactic in World War II. The Red Terror officially begins September 5th, 1918. Cheka executes between 10,000 and 15,000 in the first 2 months. Lists published in Cheka Weekly and official press. By comparison, the Tsarist regime pronounced fewer death sentences over 92 years, 1825 to 1917, than the Cheka executes in weeks. And Tsarist sentences often got commuted to forced labor. Cheka bullets do not. 1919, Leon Trotsky orders draconian measures to stop desertion in the Red Army. 616 hardcore deserters executed out of 837,000 total draft dodgers and deserters. A majority classified as weak-willed or handed back to military authorities, formed into units, sent to rear armies or directly to the front. Even those listed as malicious deserters return to ranks when reinforcement demand becomes desperate. Amnesty weeks prohibit punitive measures against desertion. 98,000 to 132,000 deserters voluntarily return. Still, the violence is systematic. From March 12 to 14 Damas 1919, Astrakhan sees strikes break out over low rations and arrests of non-Bolshevik socialists. The 45th Infantry Regiment refuses to shoot demonstrators. Mutineers join strikers, raid Bolshevik headquarters, kill party officials. Sergei Kirov, president of the Revolutionary Military Committee of the Astrakhan region, orders merciless extermination of White Guard vermin by all means necessary. Cheka units crush the strike and mutiny. Between 2,000 and 4,000 strikers and mutineers are executed or drowned, thrown from barges in the Volga with stones tied to their necks. Then, starting March 15th, repression hits the bourgeois accused of inspiring the plot. Workers and soldiers were just rank and file. This is the fate awaiting soldiers who survive 1917 only to get caught in the Civil War. The Eastern Front formally ends in March 1918 with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Russia gives up 1 million square miles. Lenin signs it to stop the war, but war does not stop. The Civil War begins, Reds versus Whites, peasant armies, foreign intervention. It lasts until 1922. Estimates of deaths vary wildly. The Bolsheviks theorized violence as mass terror long before they took power. Lenin developed the concept in 1905, explaining that the proletariat and poor farming communities should resort to mass terror when facing czarist regime violence. The call reappears in October 1917. The Bolsheviks, a small minority, encourage all social violence. Violence of soldiers deserting by the millions, violence of peasant uprisings in autumn 1917, violence of a displaced, starving urban proletariat. The Cheka, formed December 10th, 1917, is the enforcement arm. The Extraordinary Commission against Counter-Revolution, Sabotage, and Speculation. An August 18, 1919 article in Krasny Mek, the Kiev Cheka newspaper, makes it explicit: we reject the old morality and humanity invented by the bourgeoisie to oppress and exploit the lower classes. Our morality has no precedent. Our humanity is absolute because it rests on a new ideal. Destroy any form of oppression and violence. Language dehumanizes victims, makes murder ideological, keeps threats imminent even when condemned by history. Mass terror is supposed to bring a regenerated, purified world. Back to the soldiers, the ones who walked away in 1917, where do they go? Home, mostly. Back to villages. The peasant commune, the mire, revives in 1917. Political authority collapses. Hundreds of thousands of peasants in their prime, heads of small holdings. The older sons who were to inherit are dead. The survivors return. The village unites against non-peasants, settles conflicts over land. A vindictive majority imposes collective organization, takes action against the privileged, noble landowners, ecclesiastics. Separator peasants enriched by commercializing produce. The litany of deaths announced in each village contributes to outburst of violence, smoldering since 1905. Assassinations, fires. The countryside behind the lines suffers as much as the front lines. Social order breaks. For soldiers, coming home means entering chaos, land redistribution, revenge, starvation. If the commune does not accept you, many soldiers bring nothing but trauma and hunger. They fought 3 years, lost limbs, saw friends die, endured cold, lice, typhus, shelling. They return to villages that have no food, no economy, no law. Some adapt, some die quietly. Disease, typhus, cholera, kills more in 1918 to 1920 than combat did in some years of the war. The influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919, fueled by mass movement of refugees, demobilizing armies, repatriated prisoners, proves deadlier than the war itself on the Eastern Front. Estimates of civilian deaths in Russia during the war are uncertain. Soviet demographer Boris Urlanis estimated 500,000 civilian deaths due to wartime privations up to the end of 1917. A 2004 Handbook on Human Losses in the 20th Century by a Russian historian estimated 1,140,000 war-related Russian civilian deaths from 1914 to 1917, 410,000 from military operations, 730,000 from other causes. But these numbers do not capture what happens after the front collapses. Refugees. By autumn 1915, an estimated 800,000 Russian soldiers had died. The Germans and Austrians forced a massive retreat from Galicia and Poland, not just soldiers retreating, civilians fleeing. Hordes of desperate people stream into Russian cities already struggling under the war effort. Store shelves emptied, inflation soaring. By spring 1917, 6 million refugees are displaced. Where do they go? Into the countryside, into the cities, into the path of armies. They mix with deserters, with demobilized soldiers, with the bagmen trying to find food. Social fabric shreds. In 1918, the separation of Ukraine and the Kuban region, the grain-producing areas, reverses the surplus into a shortage of over 190 million poods. As free exchange of commodities with the South stops, the provisioning of guberniyas remaining in the Soviet Republic worsens. Other grain sources cannot make up the lack. The food crisis deepens into spring 1918 and beyond. Starvation is not just a word, By 1918 to 1921, famine kills an estimated 5 million people in Russia. The seizing of grain during the Civil War exacerbates it. This is what soldiers walk into when they desert. This is the home they return to. Then there are the prisoners. 2.5 million Russian soldiers listed as prisoners or missing by the US War Department count, the UK War Office. Based on a December 1918 telegram from Petrograd to Copenhagen, lists 2.5 million POWs. Some historians estimate over 5 million passed into captivity, the majority during 1915. Extreme reports from the official USSR Commission name 3.3 million Orygs. Imperial Russian Army general and military historian Golovin, working with German veterans and Central Powers archives, names 2,410,000. Numbers are contradictory because records are incomplete. Prisoners die, some return, some do not. For men in POW camps, 1917 and 1918 bring no liberation. Germany is still at war. Austria, Hungary is collapsing, but not releasing prisoners. Camps are overcrowded. Food scarce. When the war ends in November 1918, repatriation takes months, sometimes years. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 does not include prisoner exchange clauses that benefit everyone. Some POWs return to a Russia that no longer exists as they remember it. The Tsar is dead. Bolsheviks control the government. The Civil War is starting. Former prisoners often get conscripted again, by Reds, by Whites, by whichever army reaches them first. Others stay in camps because returning home is impossible. Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states are breaking away. Where is home if your province is now a different country? Some prisoners never make it out. Disease kills thousands in camps during and after the war. The Romanov family's fate mirrors the army's. Nicholas abdicates March 2nd, March 15th, New Style. He is reunited with his family at Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo on March 22nd, placed under house arrest by the provisional government. In August 1917, after a failed attempt to send them to the United Kingdom, King George V is Nicholas's cousin but refuses asylum, Kerensky's government moves the family. In April 1918, the Bolsheviks move Nicholas, Alexandra, and their daughter Maria to Yekaterinburg under Vasily Yakovlev. Alexei, with severe hemophilia, is too ill to travel. He and his sisters Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia stay in Tobolsk until May. The family is imprisoned in the Ipatiev house, the house of special purpose. Conditions worsen. Nicholas is forbidden to wear epaulets. Sentries scrawl lewd drawings on the fence to offend his daughters. March 1st, 1918, they are placed on soldiers, rations. 10 servants dismissed. They give up butter and coffee. By mid-July, Czechoslovak Legion forces close on Yekaterinburg to protect the Trans-Siberian Railway. The Bolsheviks, falsely believing the Czechoslovaks are coming to rescue the family, panic. July 17th, 1918, New Style, the family and their remaining retainers are herded into a cellar, shot and stabbed to death, ending the Romanov dynasty's 3 centuries of rule. The Bolsheviks initially announce only Nicholas's death. For 8 years they maintain disinformation. Not until 1926 does the Soviet regime acknowledge killing the entire family, but claim bodies were destroyed and Lenin's cabinet was not responsible. No written document has been found proving Lenin or Yakov Sverdlov ordered the executions. Investigations after state archives opened in the post-Soviet years confirm this. However, Lenin and Sverdlov endorsed the killings after they occurred. The Tsar, who sent 12 million men to war, dies in a cellar, bullet-riddled. In the same year, his army dissolves into terror and famine. For the soldiers, there's no single ending, no clean date when it stops. The Eastern Front officially closes March 1918. The Civil War continues until 1922. The famines, the typhus, the violence, it all overlaps. Some men who walked away in 1917 are dead by 1918. Some survive into the 20s, settle into Soviet life. Some emigrate, if they can. White Army remnants evacuate from Crimea in 1920, sail to Constantinople, scatter across Europe. Soldiers from the Tsar's army end up in Paris, in Berlin, in Harbin. Some never leave Russia, just disappear into the population. The Bolsheviks do not track former Imperial Army soldiers unless they resist. Millions of men simply vanish from the record. Their fates are unwritten. The Eastern Front killed more than the Western Front for Germany. General Günther Blumentritt writes in his memoirs, "I will cite a little-known but significant fact. Our losses on the Eastern Front were much higher than on the Western." Historian Olenikov estimates Russian losses at 5,100,000 people. Maximum estimate reaches 6 million casualties. Ratio much better than the Western Front, but better does not mean survivable. By the time the dust settles, counting the war, the revolution, the Civil War, the famine, Estimates of total deaths in Russia from 1914 to 1922 range from 15 to over 20 million. Civilians, soldiers, prisoners, refugees, the murdered, the starved, the diseased. The scale is almost incomprehensible. And it started with one thing: the army stopped functioning. 7 million men under arms in April 1917. By December, most are gone. Not killed by Germans, killed by hunger, by chaos, by their own government's collapse. If you care about understanding the mechanisms of collapse, subscribe. We dive into these events with primary sources and official data. This is the second call to action, and we want to hear from you. What city are you in right now? The script you are hearing draws on detailed archival research, including the Eastern Front casualty studies published by historian Alexei Olenikov, available through the Russian Defense Ministry archives, and the comprehensive war loss analysis from the War Losses Russian Empire Handbook published on the 1914 to 1918 online encyclopedia in January 2025, which synthesized data from the International Labor Office's 1924 questionnaire responses, Soviet demographic studies by Boris Urlanis from the 1960s, and cross-referenced Central Powers military records, back to the soldiers. The individual stories are fragments. A letter from the front, March 1917, quoted in censorship materials: "We have no bread. The bakery stopped. Horses are dying." Another, summer 1917, "The officers do not lead us anymore. The committee decides everything. We do not know if we will attack or retreat." A third, autumn 1917, "I am walking home. The war is finished for me. There is no reason to stay." These letters, collected in the volume edited by Alexander Astashov and published in 2014, titled Letters from the War 1914 to 1917, show the progression: early war, patriotism, duty, fear, mid-war, exhaustion, supply complaints, loss of hope; late war, total breakdown. By autumn 1917, soldiers write openly about desertion. No one stops them. The state has no power to enforce the mail, let alone the front. The censorship materials and commissar reports from 1917 show the same pattern. In spring, units still nominally follow structure. By summer, after the Kerensky Offensive fails, every report mentions discipline problems, refusal to advance, soldiers electing new commanders, committees voting down orders. By autumn, the reports describe chaos, units disintegrating mid-battle, men walking away in groups of dozens, hundreds, entire regiments vanishing overnight. The phrase that appears again and again in the reports: no control. Commanders have no control. The state has no control. The front is a fiction. Soldiers are just armed men going in whatever direction they choose. And in October, when the Bolsheviks take Petrograd, those directions lead home, or to the nearest town, or into the countryside to forage. The war for them ends not with a treaty, but with walking away. The Czechoslovak Legion, numbering about 800 men under the Tsarist regime, expands to 4 regiments after the February Revolution. Approved by Kerensky for independent organization after they fight well at Zborov during the Kerensky Offensive. By the time of the collapse, they number 30,000. They are supposed to be transported to France for the Western Front, but the outbreak of the Civil War complicates departure. The Legion responds by taking control of the Trans-Siberian Railway, 6,000 miles, in an ultimately successful effort to reach Vladivostok and board ships for home. In the process, they become a significant military force during the Civil War. This is what happens when a functional military unit remains intact in a sea of collapse. They survive because they have cohesion, discipline, purpose. The Russian soldiers have none of these by late 1917. Purpose died with the Tsar, discipline died with Order Number 1, cohesion died with hunger. Another detail from the Eastern Front: the Women's Battalions of Death, formed in spring and summer 1917. The idea is to shame men into fighting. The battalions, led by women volunteers, are supposed to demonstrate revolutionary spirit. One of the most visible is the all-women battalion that serves in Petrograd, returns from services at St. Isaac's Cathedral in June 1917. Photographs show them in formation, armed, proud. The battalions see limited combat. The notion that they can inspire mass mobilization is wildly optimistic. The state forms them as propaganda, proof that even women will fight. Most men at the front are not inspired. They are hungry. Exhausted, done. The presence of women volunteers does not reverse the moral collapse. Some of these women fight, some die. Most of the formations disband as the army disintegrates. Their bravery does not matter. Nothing can reverse the collapse once it starts. The German capture of Riga in September 1917 is a case study. The city falls not because of overwhelming German force, but because Russian defenders refuse to fight. As German troops approach, soldiers flee. officers cannot rally them. 60,000 casualties, many from the chaos of retreat, from hunger, from disease, not from combat. Riga was defensible. The force present was adequate, but adequacy requires soldiers willing to hold positions. In September 1917, that no longer exists. Kornilov stabilizes the front, but stabilizing means stopping a rout, not restoring offensive capacity. The army is still technically in the field when the October Revolution happens. It is not an army. It is millions of armed men waiting for permission to leave. And after the Bolsheviks take power, they do not wait for permission anymore. This is important. The February Revolution overthrows the Tsar. The October Revolution overthrows the provisional government. But the army collapse happens in the gap between those events. March to November 1917. 8 months. That is how long it takes for the largest army on earth to cease functioning as a military force. Not because of enemy action, because the state cannot feed its soldiers, cannot enforce orders, cannot provide a reason to keep fighting. The Kerensky Offensive in July is the breaking point. Before that, the army is dysfunctional but present. After that, it is gone. Units remain on maps, soldiers remain at the front. But the machinery of war is dead. The Germans know it. They do not have to attack aggressively. They just wait. By the time the Bolsheviks sign Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, the front has been a fiction for 5 months. The human cost of this collapse is not counted in a single ledger. Official casualty figures for the war: 1.7 million Russian dead, 4.95 million wounded, 2.5 million prisoners and missing, 9.15 million total casualties. These are the numbers from the United States War Department, the UK War Office, the Soviet government's 1924 reply to the International Labour Office. But these numbers stop in 1917 or 1918. They do not count the deaths from the collapse itself, the deserters who die in the countryside from hunger, the prisoners who never make it home, the soldiers who survive the front only to be killed in the Civil War, the civilians who die from the food crisis triggered by the army's disintegration, the combined toll of war, revolution, civil war, famine, disease, 15 to 20 million dead in Russia from 1914 to 1922. And it started with the decision to mobilize 12 million men into an army the state could not sustain. One last detail: the boundary markers. In areas where the front stabilized after 1915, lines held until the collapse in 1917. Some of those lines had physical markers: posts, cairns, trenches that became permanent features. When archaeologists and historians examine the Eastern Front today, they find these markers. They also find mass graves, thousands of bodies, some from combat, some from executions, some unidentified. In the chaos of 1917, record-keeping ceased. Soldiers died and were buried in unmarked pits, or they were not buried at all. The Eastern Front does not have the preserved trench systems of the Western Front. It has scattered bones, fragments of equipment, and vast stretches where the dead just disappeared into the soil. No names, no markers, just gone. The collapse of the Russian army in 1917 is not a story about battles lost. It is a story about the state failing to meet the basic requirement of any military force: keep your soldiers alive and give them a reason to fight. Food, command structure, purpose. All three gone by summer 1917. What happens to the men is inevitable. They walk away. Some survive, most do not. The official narrative, Soviet, later Russian, prefers to focus on the revolution, the Bolshevik victory, the birth of the Red Army. That narrative skips over the months when 7 million men dissolved into the countryside, when officers were lynched, when soldiers starved in the trenches waiting for orders that never came. The truth is uglier. The truth is that the largest army ever fielded disintegrated from the inside, and the men who composed it either died or scattered, and the state that sent them to war collapsed before the war ended. No victors, no honor, just hunger, chaos, and walking away. That is the brutal fate of Russian soldiers during the army collapse in 1917. That is what happens when the machinery of the state breaks and leaves millions of armed, starving men to decide their own fates. Some chose to go home, some chose violence. All chose survival over service, because by 1917, there was nothing left to serve.